Basically, you just say 200 AD plus minus 25 years.
What evidence do we have that, for example, the Gospel of Mark ended at 16:8 and not at verse 20? So the Temple Scroll is largely a rewriting of Deuteronomy that gets rid of Moses. God and the angels are giving the law directly, and so Moses has disappeared. So that's fascinating too.
Doctors Richard Carrier, Dennis R. McDonald, Patreon supporter of mine, asks, how old are the reasonably complete manuscripts of each of the four Gospels? When does he date the Muratorian Fragment?
So take that in reverse order. I don't have firm opinions on the Muratorian Fragment. I lean towards late date rather than early. Since it's undateable and it's part of a genre that we see already in the 2nd century happening of making up stories as to the backgrounds of the Gospels. Certainly the anti-Marcionite prologues are an example of this, and we see this in Irenaeus and so on. I think there's already legends by the end of late 2nd century that look like things like the Muratorian Fragment, but I think it keeps getting developed. So I think the arguments for a 4th century date are more persuasive, but I think it's inconclusive. So I don't have any firm landing point on that. As far as the manuscripts, basically you just say 200 AD plus minus 25 years. It's probably the answer to that. Is the earliest reasonably complete individual Gospels or collections of is, I think the largest fragments we have, the multiple pages and stuff, comes around that time. And then the earliest complete New Testaments that we have would be the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, which are early 4th century, or beginning of 4th century and first third of the 4th century, first half of it. Notice my date ranges are a 50-year window. We can't be any more precise than that. But we don't have anything that is reasonably complete that we can conclusively date earlier than 200 AD. Would be my answer to that.
Dennis, do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think the canon moratory is late. But I think it, for that reason, ought not to be dismissed, because there are some very peculiar things in the Muratorian canon that need to be digested as a part of the reception of the canonical work. And I'm not an expert on canonical history, so I would agree basically with scholars who date it late, but that's not a reason to ignore it. And I think the role of Marcion in shaping the canon has to be revisited. I have my own read on that. We can talk about it at some point. We have the Marcionite canon, we have Tatian, we have so on. I think the issue when we have complete manuscripts is one way of asking the question, and I would agree with Richard about that time span. And when we have these full versions, they almost are twinned with another gospel. So it's not as if you have circulating, widespread individual gospels.
Right.
We know of that later. But most of the time they're twinned, either because we have only fragments of the material. It's possible that we have some things lost, but it's more likely that we have an early four-gospel collection.
Yeah, I agree.
So that has to be factored in. But the other way to ask the question is, what evidence do we have that, for example, the Gospel of Mark ended at 16:8 and not at verse 20? Or what evidence do we have that the Gospel of John was known with all of its parts, including the epilogue? Or so there are other because we have other evidence that needs to be factored in, other than concrete manuscripts of entire books. So the question is a very good one, and I wish we had full versions of these texts earlier than the time span that Richard is suggesting, but we don't. But that doesn't mean that that's an entirely silent period before that time for evidence of the integrity of this literature.
Yeah. Right.
Well, then I might as well follow up with the next question that the same gentleman is asking, and it gets into something personally, your own opinion on these things, maybe. What do you consider the greatest manuscript discovery since 1800? Possible candidates, for example, and you might say something else. Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, Didache, Gospel of Peter, Apocalypse of Peter, Dead Sea Scrolls, Nag Hammadi, Gospel of Judas, if genuine, or some other document he might bring forward. So,
Good Lord. Man, I don't even categorize. There's too many. It would be depend on your metric, right? Like.
what do you like, or whatever?
Well, I mean, let's take, for example, Nag Hammadi. I find that discovery largely of not much use for explaining the origins of Christianity. But it was absolutely earth-shattering and really crucially important for understanding of the development of Christianity. Likewise, the Dead Sea Scrolls don't really help us explain, because they're not Christian, right? So there's no Christian history there. But the Dead Sea Scrolls radically altered our understanding of the Judaism that was in place out of which Christianity emerged. So it hugely changed our understanding of the context and origins of Christianity. So like those are two like really earth-shattering and important discoveries. Now, how would I rank one more than the other? I wouldn't want to lose either one, so I really can't like say one's more important than the other. And when you say things like, Vaticanus, the discoveries of those, and so far you want to call them discoveries, those have their own incredibly powerful, important roles in terms of understanding the development of the Bible around that time, the scribal practice, and canonical understanding. And there's lots of other. So it depends on what thing you're looking at that you want to know is what is the most important thing for that particular question, and then you could pick one maybe. But in terms of otherwise, it's all important. In fact, I wish there were more of these kind of amazing discoveries. So that would be my answer to that. I know it's not a terribly useful answer, but
No, I think it's a helpful answer. I would say the most important discovery is not found in a cave. It's found in my book on the Q. So, and I'm serious that there are other ways of discovering ancient manuscripts other than digging them up out of sand. But so that's somewhat facetious and self-serving. I think it's the Dead Sea Scrolls have to take the cake for me, but in a way that maybe people don't appreciate. First of all, and this is not the most important thing for me, is it gives us a sense of the diversity of Judaism at the time, and we have and also its bilingualism, because we have Greek, Aramaic, and trilingualism, and Hebrew manuscripts. It helps us set Judaism in the first century and gives us a different understanding of Jewish sectarianism at the time. Mm-hmm. I think it's huge. But here's another piece of it. The biblical manuscripts at Qumran are sometimes not given enough attention, because we already know texts of Deuteronomy, we already know texts of the Psalter, we already have texts of Habakkuk, and so on. So the energy at first was on materials we did not have: the Temple Scroll, the War Scroll, certain worship texts, and so on. And it's understandable in the history of scholarship why you'd want to put a premium price on things you haven't seen before. But what's becoming fascinating is that the biblical text itself was plastic, even among those who cherished it most. And so we have textual variants that are really interesting. And it shows that these sectarians were not fundamentalists. That is, that when they transcribed texts, they used creativity and theological judgment and put things together in several interesting ways. And for me, what's fascinating about that is the way that Deuteronomy gets rewritten over and over again, because the community probably considered it to be the most important book of the Hebrew Bible. that gave them the Mosaic final word, and so on. And so the community valued it and rewrote it in the Temple Scroll. So the Temple Scroll is largely a rewriting of Deuteronomy that gets rid of Moses. God and the angels are giving the law directly, and so Moses has disappeared. So that's fascinating too.
I know in the Enochian literature, Moses really isn't an issue. Like, the reason it's Enoch, they're like, let's go before Moses and have more of a universal perspective, because Moses gets narrowed a lot of times into this Jewish, and they're like, no, we're humanity at large kind of picture, pre-Diluvian. I don't know, but
Well, so in a sense, I would say that the Dead Sea Scrolls illumine Christian origins, not because what they say about John the Baptist or Jesus or whatever, but they tell us what the status of biblical authority was among Jews in the first century, and how plastic it was, and flexible. So that you have biblical diversity going on at Qumran in a way that I think helps us understand the diversity and the plasticity of the biblical interpretation in the New Testament.
Yeah, for sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow.